Hello, this is podcast 5 in the series of podcasts that looks at Nazi policies towards the Jews between 1933 and 1939. Okay, so just by means of a sort of brief recap, the first podcast we looked at what Nazi views were, very, very clear. Hitler was anti-Semitic, he despised the Jews, ultimately he wanted to get the Jews to leave Germany. Those were very much the principles that he was working with. Keep emphasising the point that the way policy eventually moved in World War II towards mass extermination, that does not mean Hitler planned that from the beginning. Certainly in the 1930s, all the evidence is he simply wanted to make life so miserable for Jews that they would leave Germany. In the rise to power, the Jews were very, very important as a scapegoat. Okay, so Hitler targeted the Jews, he blamed the Jews for Germany's problems as a way of selling his message of national unity. He needed to have an outsider to focus Germans against. Jews were a minority, remember, there was only 500,000 Jews, that's 1% of the population, but a very, very useful scapegoat as a means of blaming Germany's problems of the Weimar Republic on the Jews. We then, in the most recent podcast, looked at how Jewish policies evolved in the early years, 1933 to 35, and I think a key theme was that policy was non-violent. On the whole, there was violence against the Jews, but it was, on the whole, Hitler did not encourage violence against the Jews. So actions against the Jews were the passing of laws that separated Jews, forced them to have their own facilities, and that all came to a head in September 1935, the most recent podcast that we did, which we said was a turning point with the passing of the Nuremberg laws, which in fact remember there were 3 of them, and you can see the 3 of them clearly shown there. There was the citizenship law that took citizenship away from the Jews, the blood law, or more commonly called the proper title, the law for the protection of German blood and honour, which forbade Jews from having sexual relations with Aryans or marrying them, and the flag law that forbade them from flying the flag, that effectively reduced Jews to being unwanted guests. Okay, now this podcast focuses in on the next 2 years, which are often called the quiet years, 1936 to 37. And just by means of an introduction on that particular one, just return to this sort of key point. Remember, in the early years, 1933 to about 1936, even 37, Hitler's main job was really to sort of rebuild German strength, and he needed to do that without threatening the rest of the world. He didn't want the rest of the world to know really his true intentions, which we of course now know was about waging war eastwards for living space, which would involve a huge war against Poland and Russia at some point in the early 1940s. Now, of course, if the Allies, the British and the Americans and the French, got wind of Hitler's real intentions and they realised he was serious about them, then Germany would be at risk, because of course the Treaty of Versailles has reduced Germany to a position of weakness. The German army is only 100,000 strong. So in these early years, Hitler is effectively rebuilding German strength and sending out messages to the Allies, which is a lie, that his intentions are peaceful and he just wants to have a fair settlement. The Treaty of Versailles should be revised fairly so that it was treating Germany more fairly. Now, that's another reason why in the early years Hitler had to be careful with his Jewish policy. So, for example, many of Germany's biggest employers were Jews. The biggest German department store, for example, a firm called Tietz, Tietz, was a Jewish department store that employed hundreds of thousands of people. Hitler needed to create jobs in the early years. A major promise that he made before he became Chancellor was that he would resolve the problem of unemployment. He's not going to resolve the problem of unemployment if he targets Jews in the early years, because they contribute too much towards the economy. And so therefore he had to tread carefully. Other things, if he used violence against the Jews in these early years, that might upset the Americans, the British and the French. Remember, if Germany does upset the Allies, the countries that won World War One, they could choose to invade Germany, as they had done back in 1923 when they invaded the Ruhr. So he did have to tread carefully. There were, for example, instances in 1933 where stormtroopers overtrod the mark and attacked Jews on the streets of Germany, and it turned out they were American Jews, tourists, for example. So Hitler had to be very, very clear that there should be no violence against the Jews. Now, that's why this context of 1936 to 7 is so important. Following the Nuremberg laws, Hitler's entering 2 years where he's now really testing the waters. He's pushing the boundaries. He's breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but he wants to send a message out to the British, the French and the Americans that his intentions are peaceful. So he sent a very clear message to his own stormtroopers and to the SS that there needed to be a year or two in which there was no real action against the Jews. Okay, so these are what we call the quiet years, 1936 to 37. Okay, no new actions against the Jews. Remember, 1936, summer of 1936, the spotlight of the world was on Germany because of the Olympic Games. Again, Hitler's testing the waters. He is starting to rearm. If the Allies didn't like that and decided to stop him, then Germany would have to back down. Germany could not win a war at this point against the French or the British or the Americans. The German army isn't strong enough, and he doesn't want war against those countries anyway. Remember, he's preparing for a war in the east against Russia. So anything that might sort of alarm the Allies, Hitler needed to avoid, particularly when the world is looking at him with the Olympic Games. So he needed to he needed to make sure he didn't appear too radical. And that word radical, that I'm just underlined there, means extreme, a good word to use in your essays. He didn't want to appear to be too extreme. He's testing at this time how far he can break the Treaty of Versailles. At a stage when Germany is still too weak to risk war, okay? And he still needs to maintain that appearance that he is a peaceful leader, and that any aggressive actions is merely not because he wants war, but because he wants a fair settlement. He wants the Treaty of Versailles to be revised fairly, so he's testing the waters. So he's trying to present an image to the rest of the world that he is a moderate statesman. Okay, he's the leader of a country that had been treated unfairly by the Treaty of Versailles. And what he's doing is he's making a case that his demands for revision, again there's a key word, revisionism, is to revise the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He's saying they are just and reasonable demands. I am not looking for war. I am just looking for a fair revision of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And any extreme action against the Jews would have upset this image, okay, which he's anxious not to avoid. So following the Nuremberg laws, which drew that very clear line in the sand that Jews were not welcome, actually, if you were a Jew still living in Germany, and there weren't that many left, many of them had left, remember, by this point, in a sense they got a feeling during the quiet years that maybe they had ridden the storm, that they'd gone through the worst times. And that things were quietening down. Yes, okay, they didn't have the same rights as Aryans, but nevertheless they did have rights that had been clearly defined. So German Jews, in a sense, breathed a sigh of relief during these quiet years. Little did they know, of course, the storm that was about to hit them, and that storm arrived in the year 1938, and that's what we'll look at in the next podcast. So there are a few factual questions just to test your understanding. Again, remember, precise knowledge needs to be on show when you write your answers in the exam. Don't talk in general terms, it is about precision. That's why we put these factual tests in here. So the answers, as you know, will be on the next slide. So just pause the podcast, have a go, see how much of it you can remember, test yourself out, put them on flashcards, stick them on your bedroom wall, all that sort of thing. Play the podcast through to the end, you'll see the answers. There are the answers to those questions. Okay, hopefully that was useful for you. The next podcast, which is the last in the series, will then look at the year 1938 and how policy became radicalised with the invasion of Austria and what we call Crystal Night. Thank you.